Welcome to our event tonight. Thanks for coming out. I am Jeff Potts, the police chief here, and we think we have a great event in store for you here tonight. But first, thanks for coming out and being a part of this. This is the first time we've done this presentation here in Bloomington, and we're excited to share this information with you. In just a minute, I'm going to introduce Katie Chase, and she'll introduce the rest of the group, but we're real lucky to have a partnership with the Hazelden Betty Ford Center here tonight. The representatives from there are the ones who actually kind of set up the scene, and they're going to go through it. They're going to give a presentation. We're also going to have one of our narcotics investigators come in and be a part of the panel as well to present some information and maybe be able to answer some questions. Just want to kind of clarify, we're not here to scare anybody. We're not here to, alarm people to an extreme, but I think we are here just to share some information. We, and I'm sure the folks from the Hazelden Betty Ford are aware of situations far too often where there's things going on inside people's homes that if you were a little bit more informed or knew a little bit more information, you might be able to stop some bad things from happening before they happen. And so our goal really is just to make you a little bit more aware of some things that might be going on. We're not suggesting that they are, and show you some things that might be in your kids or grandkids or relatives, friends' bedrooms that at first glance you might not be aware of what they are. But after you hear the presentation and we show you a little bit more in detail, they might be some cues or clues as to some things going on inside the home that you might not be aware of, that you want to be aware of. And we are going to also give you some information on what to do if you come across some stuff. So again, thanks for coming out tonight. We're very excited to have you guys here. We're excited to do this presentation. I want to turn things over to our crime prevention coordinator, Katie Chase, who really is the one who kind of helped really spearhead and organize and pull this event together. So Katie, you want to take it from here?
Thank you, everybody, for coming out. I really appreciate it. Like the chief said, we're not here to try to overwhelm any of you. I myself have 3 young kids, and I feel that you always need more education and more tools in our toolbox to help us as we raise children. And times are constantly changing, and it's hard to stay up on the next thing. And hopefully tonight you can take away at least a couple key pieces that are helpful in raising kids or having kids in your life. So really take this time to observe what you can, but know that we are giving you a lot at one time, so try not to be too overwhelmed. So thank you so much for coming. Really do appreciate it. The resources are outside on the table, so help yourself to anything that's out there. If you need extra copies for a neighborhood or a place of where you work, if you want more, just let me know. I'm happy to get them for you. So I'm going to turn it over to the panel. They're going to do a presentation first on some items, and then we're going to do like a question and answer type panel at the end. It's really your time to ask any questions. Anything, there's no questions, a silly question. That's what we're here for, to kind of just work through them all together. So in that regard, I'm going to introduce Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. We have Cindy is here, and so is Jessica. And then we also have Detective Maloney from the Bloomington Police Department. He's our narcotics super specialist, so knows lots of great tips for you on things that are really relevant here in Bloomington. So thanks so much. I'll turn it to you guys.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us, to the City of Bloomington and the Police Department, for putting this together. As is mentioned, we're here for an important conversation. Fact of the matter is, most of our kids are making smart choices. We know that. The other fact of the matter is that sometimes we have kids who are struggling. We know about that firsthand because we work at our adolescent and young adult facility in Plymouth, Minnesota, where we treat about 1,200 young people a year from across the country who are struggling with drug addiction and mental health issues. So if we didn't have any issues, we wouldn't need to be here tonight. So we want to educate people to prevent people hopefully from needing the services that we have to offer. So that being said, as Katie said, I'm Jessica Wong, and I work at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. I've been here for 14 years, working almost exclusively with adolescent and young adult services. So we have about 18 hours worth of content to go through in about 60 minutes. So we're going to talk pretty quickly, and then Detective Maloney may have some things to interject specifically as it relates to this community or some of the things he's seeing. And then, as mentioned, we'll open it up for Q&A at the end.
Hi, everybody. I'm Cindy Palmer. Can you hear me okay? If I just have, awesome. I, too, work for the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation at our Plymouth location, adolescent and young adult facility. And this project, gosh, what did it start 3 years ago? Mm-hmm. And we just had this idea because there's always intervention. If something goes bad, you want to intervene, right? And then there's treatment. But there's this gray area of kind of what happens beforehand, before you need that intervention. And what are signs and symptoms to look for? We never really talk about that. So we thought that that was super important, and we needed to find some answers. And so what we did is we collaborated, as you can see on the screen, with many organizations around the Twin Cities. And it was intentional. We did people that were in different areas and were specialists in different areas, including us, which were specialists in the addiction area. And by doing that, we developed this awesome presentation that with all of the ideas and interesting facts that came from all of these other organizations. So I hope you will gain some knowledge after we talk to you today.
So as the chief said, our intention is not to scare you. The fact of the matter is, what we hope to accomplish by traveling around the state of Minnesota and doing this presentation is bringing awareness so we prevent kids from ending up needing treatment, or worse yet, ending up losing their life in one capacity or another. On the screen, you see 5 young people from the state of Minnesota who have lost their life for one reason or another related to alcohol or other drugs. And perhaps had there been better education or more awareness about what they were struggling with, those things could have been prevented. So that's our goal tonight. As I mentioned, we treat about 1,200 young people in our facility, and every single parent that walks a young person into treatment with us has at one point said, that will never be my kid. And the fact of the matter is, it is. It's our neighbors, it's people that we go to church with, it's people in our kids' school, it's people that we work with. And so we want to educate everybody, because addiction is not something that discriminates. Anyone or everyone could be potentially addicted to something at some point. So if we can teach you how to recognize early warning signs, overall that will make the community stronger.
So you probably saw some items in the room, and some of those items that we have in the room was a trumpet mouthpiece, an inhaler, a highlighter, an apple. Out of all these, what do you think that all of these have in common? Is there anything that you think any of these items on the screen have in common? We can make this interactive. I love that when that happens.
You can hide things.
Absolutely, good answer. You can hide things in them, definitely. And another answer could be they could be different drug delivery systems. You could make a trumpet mouthpiece into a pipe, but with a Pringles can. An inhaler, you could take out the medication that is prescribed and put in the medication that they would like, such as marijuana. The highlighter is interesting. It can be used as a couple of different things. You can take out the insides and have it as a storage container for drugs or their drug of choice, or it can be utilized as a pipe. You can put a couple holes on it, take out the inside, and utilize it as a pipe. Last but not least, some of the counselors at our Hazelden Plymouth site have said a lot of the kids are doing this today, where any type of fruit or vegetable that can be cored out, you can smoke out of it. So you put a couple holes in it and put some tin foil on there, light it up, put your marijuana in there or whatever, and you can smoke from it. So if you find a fruit or vegetable that has a funny odor, and they've never really eaten fruit or vegetables before, there could potentially be an issue there.
Now, that being said, if your son or daughter has asked you to purchase some apples from the grocery store, it does not mean they have a drug problem. So part of the conversation we want to have tonight is about looking at kind of the bigger picture. Individually on its own, an apple might not be a reason for concern. But if you see an apple that has a couple holes in it and you notice a strange odor and your son or daughter or your neighbor or whomever has been acting differently, you're starting to put together enough information to say, you know what, I need to look into this further. So don't panic if you just purchased apples at the grocery store yesterday. In general, they're probably being used for good things, but these are just things to keep your eye out for so that we can intervene on kids who need help earlier rather than waiting until it's too late.
Great.
So, anybody know what this young man is doing in the picture? He is snorting alcohol, that's correct. So these, on the next couple of slides is just a couple of different ways that kids are ingesting alcohol beyond just drinking it, because the first thing kids will tell you when they try alcohol is what? They hate the way it tastes. So they're going to find a lot of different ways to ingest alcohol to avoid the taste, but also to get drunker faster. So you actually can snort alcohol. There's a couple more here. Anybody know what this is a picture of? I heard somebody talking about it earlier, but these are gummy bears that have been soaked in alcohol. Kind of the same purpose. You leave them soaked in alcohol for a period of time, and then you eat them, and you can get intoxicated that way, and that can also help mask the flavor. This one I put up there only because we see this very frequently at our treatment center. We're not allowed to have hand sanitizer, in fact, in the facility. Hand sanitizer and things like hairspray, sometimes mouthwash, cologne, all have a very high concentrate of alcohol. And so those things are potentially at risk for kids to abuse or misuse by drinking for the purpose of getting intoxicated. So that's another one. And then this one, this is to show you that alcohol can actually be mainlined and injected directly into the bloodstream. So some of the concerns with some of these is that you're bypassing the normal metabolic system. You're not actually digesting alcohol the way you normally would, because if you drink too much alcohol, what happens? Your body gets rid of it. Your body tries to rid itself of the poison. But when you mainline alcohol, you snort alcohol, or you do some of these other things, your body is unable to rid itself of the poison, and it's harder to dose or to know when you've overdosed. And so we see kids sometimes who end up in the emergency room for different things, for ingesting alcohol in different ways where their body's not as able to respond. A couple other things. Anybody know what this young man is doing? He's doing what it looks like he's doing. He's pouring alcohol directly into his eyeball. And the reason for that is because the membrane around the eye is very thin, and so theoretically it will absorb alcohol more quickly directly into the bloodstream, and you'll get drunker quicker. And so again, who wants to sit around and hold a solo cup full of beer and get drunk after a few hours when you could do this and theoretically get drunk right away? Now, research has it that you're not actually getting very drunk doing this, you're just more damaging your eye. But what happens is one person posts this on YouTube, and a million other kids see it and try it. And so, unfortunately, that's one thing we have working against us with kids in some of these trends, is you think, well, really is more than one person gonna come up with the idea to pour alcohol directly into their eye? Not necessarily in a vacuum, but with YouTube and social media, we see kind of trends spread that way as they get access to them online. This young man here is vaping alcohol. So you've heard a lot about juuling and e-cigarettes and kind of that trend that's on the rise with our kids. This is actually somebody who's vaping alcohol similar to the way you could vape nicotine through an e-cigarette. And again, the intention is that you'll get drunker faster. A couple more things. This is a tampon soaking in alcohol. We hear this from the school professionals that we present to a lot. Kids can insert tampons and get drunk all day long. It's odorless, essentially. You get drunk fairly quickly, and it wouldn't show up on a blood alcohol test, or a breathalyzer, I'm sorry. So there's a lot of different creative ways that kids will try to consume alcohol during the day at school, some of which is even as simple as putting alcohol in a water bottle or a thermos or something of that nature. So these are things to keep an eye out for as well. Lastly, this one is not perhaps as common, but it's indicative of a larger trend, which is the movement, the culinary movement to include alcohol in a lot more foods that is actually able to make you intoxicated. Currently, we all know if you usually cook with alcohol, it gets cooked out. But this is something called whipahol. And so it's used for desserts and drinks that has a high alcohol content that you can use also to become intoxicated.
So we're getting into drug storage right now, and you probably, when you walked through the bedroom, you saw a lot of normal items. And yes, a lot of them were normal items, but potentially they could be something of concern. For example, a teddy bear. What kids do is they'll take the seams out and they'll hide some of their favorite drugs of choice.
Here's another one. My favorite time we did this presentation, a mom saw the flip-flop on the floor and said to her friend, "Well, what do you think the flip-flop is?" And the other mom said, "I don't know, but I'm never buying flip-flops again." So that's not the case. That's not the point that we're trying to make here. But in this particular case, there's another slit that's made into the bottom. You probably can't see that from here, of the flip-flop, and pills are inserted in there. So they can walk around spring break or what have you and have their drugs right on them, and nobody would ever necessarily see those. So there's the ways that they can hide their drugs are basically endless.
So you see a can of Aquanet here. That's probably the first sign that maybe something's not right, because who uses Aquanet right now, right? However, you can go to the Container Store, you can go online, you can go to Amazon, and you can find many of these that have, you just take off the bottom, and they are storage containers.
Your
You
weed
have-
fell out.
Oh. And by the
Which
way,
is oregano.
this is oregano. We use Tic Tacs and oregano for presentation purposes. So anyway, no drugs on stage, right?
The same is true with the Ajax. This actually smells like Ajax, sounds like Ajax, but it's also, again, there's anything. You can have beer cans that do this, soda cans, any type of container that can be turned into a secret storage department that would be easy to disguise.
This is very interesting. It looks like some sunscreen, and you're going to use when you go on vacation. However, when you buy this at a local head shop, they come empty, and so they fill them with alcohol. So if you see somebody drinking their sunscreen, that could be another indicator that it probably isn't sunscreen. But these are on the market, and a lot of different bottles like this, just to conceal, because of course kids do not want you to know that they're hiding this or that they're using this stuff. This is a very interesting one. It looks like a regular tampon, but essentially what it is, so you probably wouldn't open it up, but they're called dupe tubes. So you can put a shot of alcohol in here, you can put some pills in here, whatever you want, and you can transport them to school or whatever, and just keep them in your purse.
This here looks like a bracelet. And it's actually a pipe. If you flip it around, you can see the other side of it here. There's necklaces. There's actually a couple necklaces in the room like this. There's a whole jewelry line that's actually drug paraphernalia that kids could be wearing to school that you wouldn't necessarily think anything of it, but it's actually a drug delivery system.
And like we said about drug storage, people, they'll cut out little pages in books and put their pipes in there, behind picture frames, in footballs. They'll take a little X-Acto knife and put their pills in there. And I think Jess mentioned the clothing lines. You can go online and buy actual clothing lines that have conspicuous containers in them, so, or not containers, but little Ziploc compartments in there, and shirts, pants, socks, hats, you name it. And you can just Google it and find it online.
Yeah, and as we get to the Q&A, if there's other things that you saw in the room that you're curious about, that you're wondering what did that mean or what could that possibly represent, we can talk more about some of those items at that time. The other one I just want to point out, this one was given to us by one of the local police departments. This is a glass bong or piece of glass for typically marijuana use, and so that was directly confiscated in a case that then was given to us. So I never thought I'd see the day where I was walking out of a police department with drug paraphernalia, but they generously gave it to us so we could use it for this presentation to help educate people so that they know what they're looking for, because the fact of the matter is a lot of the people that we talk to don't even know what something like that would necessarily look like, and so it's helpful to just get educated about what some of these items are.
And last but not least, on the screen, you'll see an EOS lip balm. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. A lot of times when kids are smoking marijuana wax or using marijuana wax, and we'll talk about that. It's a concentrated form of marijuana. They will put it in the lip balm containers because it looks like lip balm. It does not smell like lip balm, but it looks like lip balm. So that's very well where they could store that.
Another one to point out on there, just because it's actually pretty smart, is the deodorant, the stick of deodorant. What they do is they get a brand new deodorant. It has to be a solid. It can't be a gel. And they roll it all the way up and take it out, cut a portion of it off, and then put whatever they want in the bottom of it, marijuana or pills or what have you, and then put the top portion back on. So when you look at it, it looks like normal deodorant. But part of the reason why that's pretty smart is because the odor of the deodorant helps mask any odor that might be associated with the drug. So we see that actually quite frequently in our treatment center with kids coming into treatment trying to get drugs in while they're with us.
Yeah, that's actually another one with the Mad Honey. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but there was one kid in treatment that he said he really, really had to have some honey on his toast, but he had to order it from online from across the country. And
Nepal.
lo and behold, it was called Mad Honey, and it's a psychoactive honey that And so we caught on to that, and so the nurse sent out an email saying, please, if you see any mad honey, it has some psychedelic effects. So,
Yeah, it's a specific type of honey that comes from Nepal.
Yes,
So we had
yes.
said, we have honey in the cafeteria, you can use the honey that's there, and he said, no, I don't want that honey, I want the honey from Nepal. And so they did some research and found, of course, that was really what he was after. So we learned all kinds of things from the kids that come into treatment.
we sure do. So now we're going to talk about marijuana. It's the big topic today. I know in the state of Minnesota it's been approved for medicinal use, but not recreational use. But there are other states, and quite a few states across the country, that it is now been legalized for recreational use. So we want to do a little bit of education on marijuana and really what it's like now versus what it was like back then, and hopefully can help you out. So this is a new slide that we just put on here. So teen marijuana use. While illicit drug use has declined for teens, perceptions of the substance are changing. In 2017, daily marijuana use surpassed regular cigarette use. So it definitely is increasing, and it's increasing in a lot of different ways. And what I mean when I say that is there's a lot of different ways that individuals use marijuana. It's not the old-fashioned joint, bong, pipe that you've probably heard of. Kids are now taking in THC, which is the active ingredient that gets you high in marijuana, and they are ingesting it through edibles, different candies, different types of foods. You can really have any type of food that you can think of, from blue cheese salad dressing to who knows what, and it can be infused with THC to get you high.
One thing I just want to add about the previous slide as far as perceptions go, both Cindy and I are certified prevention professionals. Part of what they're talking about there with perceptions is that what we know for young people is the perception of harm is directly converse to their likelihood to use. So the more harmful they think a substance is, the less likely they are to use it. The less harmful they think it is, the more likely they are to use it. And with legalization or decriminalization of marijuana happening across the country, of course what we're seeing then is the perception of harm of marijuana going down, because if it was harmful, we wouldn't legalize it or decriminalize it. And so what we've seen then is not only an increase in marijuana use in the states that have legalized it, but also an increase in marijuana in other states across the country who have not yet legalized it. So that's directly impacting our ability to sort of help prevent some of those trends that we're seeing with marijuana.
Thanks for sharing that. Again, like I said, there's just multiple ways that you can ingest marijuana these days, and they're getting more creative and unique every day. And it's about profit, right? So let's look at marijuana and the THC, the average THC in marijuana. Let's look at the 1960s. It was about 0.5% of the marijuana was THC infused. Now let's look into 2014. It's up to about 14%. So we've gone from the 1960s, about 0.5%, to 2014, about 14%. And I've heard that, we're in 2019 and it's actually up to 15, 16% right now. That's actual average marijuana. Now, let's talk about a different type of marijuana that is called edibles. Unfortunately, edibles can be scary for a couple of different reasons. Number one, these are actually marijuana-infused edibles on the screen. They look identical to regular candy. You cannot tell the difference. So they say it takes about 5 to 10 milligrams of THC for an individual to get high, okay? So where's that little gummy bear? I had a little gummy bear up here. I can't find it. But okay, so let's just take one gummy bear. How much THC do you think is in one gummy bear? Does anybody have any idea? The answer is about 10 milligrams, all right? So I don't know about you, but if I'm going to eat a gummy bear, I'm probably going to eat more than one, right? So let's just give you a scenario here, and this happens all the time. Little Johnny goes to a party. They're having a few beers. They're testing things out. He got a little bag of gummy bears from Colorado, and so each of his friends ate a gummy bear. Guess what? Nothing happened. what's little Johnny and his friends going to do? They're going to have another one, right? Nothing happens. The reason why is edibles goes through your metabolic system rather than when you smoke a joint, you immediately get that high within 5 to 10 minutes. When you have an edible, it takes 2 to 4 hours to kick in. And so therefore, a lot of times you get very high marijuana intoxication that can lead to emergency room visits and so forth. So that can be very dangerous. So we like to educate people on the difference on that because who knows if recreational use is going to be coming here, but we always like to educate, right? That's one problem. The other problem with this is, like I said before, it looks like regular candy. In the state of Colorado in 2016 or 2017, the emergency room visits went up 150% for children due to over-ingesting marijuana edibles. They couldn't tell the difference, right? It was such a problem that the governor put a bill into law that indicated that these manufacturers could no longer make edibles looking like humans, animals, or fruits any longer because of this happening. So that's a problem right there. And but they got around it. Now they make rectangles and circles and squares and things like that. But so they're still making them. They're alive as ever will be. But just to let you know, it is a little bit. It can be dangerous with little children. My comment before saying that THC can be infused in a lot of different things. You can wake up in the morning and have some Fruity Loops instead of Fruit Loops. That's THC-infused cereal. You can put some little THC-infused jelly on your toast along with your cereal and have a cup of Java with some THC in it and go on your merry way to work. For lunch, like I said, you can have THC drinks, some goldfish that have THC in it. Like it's in everything. And this is just online that we found, and it's only going to continue. We're going to talk a little bit now about 3 different areas of abuse that happens with adolescent and young adults as far as prescription medication. What that means is medications that are prescribed by a healthcare professional but are still abused. The first area we're going to talk about affects the central nervous system. And those are for the sleep disorders, the anxieties, the things like that. And those are the Valium, the Xanax, the Prosom, the Ambien, the Lunesta. And those are on the right-hand side are the generic names of the prescriptions. What we've found is some school professionals have shared with us that kids are doing Xanax juicing, where they're taking bars of Xanax, putting them in their water bottles, putting some juice in there and sipping on them all day long. That's one way they're using them. I just heard on the news actually this morning about Xanax. There was something that they're really concerned because people are getting up and sleepwalking, taking Xanax, and they're cooking in their sleep, they're driving in their sleep. So it can be some really dangerous medications if you're not careful with it. The second group that kids can abuse, and they do abuse, and you've probably heard about it, are the stimulants, such as the medications for ADHD. Now, if a person truly has ADHD and they're on, let's say, Adderall, I can speak from experience with my daughter. She absolutely hates being on her medication. She said she feels awkward, she feels weird talking, she doesn't like it, because she truly has ADHD and doesn't like that medication. On the flip side, those individuals that do not have ADHD, they feel like a cocaine type high effect. They feel like they can go that extra mile. They can study that extra hour. So not only are maybe the avid drug users possibly using these medications, but you have your straight A students using them. You have your athletes using them just so they can be better, stronger, faster, and you name it, because of the fact that their prefrontal cortex in their brain is not quite developed yet. Last but not least, the third area of abuse are opioids. Now, we all have heard about the opioid crisis. What is an opioid? It's a prescription from a healthcare professional for pain. And I mean, they're really needed in our society. They really are. But they can be abused and they can be very, very addictive. Some of the opioids on the screen are codeine, hydrocodone, oxycodone, morphine, fentanyl, and methadone.
So I'm going to just share a couple of statistics. According to the U.S. Surgeon General, the United States makes up 5% of the world's population, yet we consume 80% of the world's supply of oxycodone and 99% of the world's supply of hydrocodone. So the opiate crisis that we see and hear about in the media is something that is somewhat unique to the United States. And there's a lot of factors that converge to sort of create the environment that we have currently with this particular class of drugs. I won't go into sort of that history of how that happened, but it's to know that the availability of these medications is much higher in the United States than it would be in some other countries around the world. That being said, roughly 25% of patients prescribed opioids for chronic pain end up misusing the medications they're prescribed. So as Cindy mentioned, these are highly addictive potentially. And so even though people are prescribed these medications for legitimate reasons, they can be abused even when they're prescribed for legitimate reasons, and that can sometimes lead to an addiction issue, which is what we see frequently with some of the patients that we serve. About 80% of the people who use heroin first misused prescription opioids. So very rarely do you see somebody going straight to using heroin. Typically they're sort of getting to that point through using prescription medications, and then at some point that becomes a little bit harder to get a hold of and a little bit more expensive. And it actually becomes easier and cheaper to access street heroin to support their habit. So that's another trend that we see pretty commonly. I know in our adolescent facility, right now, currently, it's about 45 to 50% of our kids have a dependence to opiates who have entered treatment. So we are still seeing pretty high numbers as it relates to this. And then lastly, in 2017, 64,000 Americans died of a drug overdose, and 75% of those overdose deaths were related to opioids. So that is something that I know there happen in our communities down the street from us. In fact, we did this presentation once up in White Bear Lake, and there was a woman who was there, and she thought, I don't know if I really want to stay here and learn about drugs. I don't know if it will really ever impact me. She decided to stay for one reason or another, and then a couple of days later emailed Cindy and I and said, I'm really glad I went to your presentation because I just found out that the neighbor across the street and one house over, their son died of an overdose to opiates since she had attended the presentation a couple days before. She had no idea he was struggling, no idea that that was something that was going on in that family, no idea that it would impact her and her neighborhood and her home. And so that's, again, kind of the overall goal of having this conversation tonight, is to bring awareness, because it's not necessarily something you'll see in your house, hopefully, but it is something absolutely that's in our communities in the Twin Cities here, and something that's important to be aware of. I think I'll just go through this pretty quickly. As I click through time here, you can see 2005, 2006. The counties that are in the red are counties that are at epidemic levels of opioid overdose deaths. So as we go forward in time, you can sort of see more and more counties reaching epidemic levels as defined by the Center for Disease Control. So here we are in 2013. You can see a side-by-side comparison. In about 11 years, we went from very few counties in the United States having an epidemic level issue with opioids to now more than half of the counties across the United States. So again, this is something that's very, very prevalent, and there's been some laws and some things that have changed in prescribing that have started to shift the trends a little bit, but we're still very much in the thick of seeing the impacts of the opioid epidemic. I'll skip signs of opiate abuse, and that way I'll just say, if we touch on something briefly tonight that you find really interesting and you want to learn a little bit more about, we have a website called topsecretproject.org. It's on all of the handouts out there, so if you don't want to remember that, you say, hey, I want to learn a little bit more about what they were talking about opiates or what have you, there's a ton more information on the website. So tonight we're kind of giving a high-level overview, but there's always more information out there. We just want to touch briefly on e-cigarette use, juuling, vaping, all of these terms, because by far and away when we talk to schools, they say this is the biggest issue that they're seeing with their kiddos. And so what I can tell you, has anybody heard of the Minnesota Student Survey? It's a survey that's done every 3 years. In fact, there are schools in the middle of conducting it right now that kind of tracks trends as it relates to drug and alcohol use, mental health, and overall wellness of our kids in schools. It's 5th, 8th, 9th, and 11th grade. And about 170,000 students take it every 3 years. And so the most recent data we have suggests that this was the Monitoring the Future study. But for 10th and 12th grade, increase in e-cigarette use was the largest ever recorded for any substance for the Monitoring the Future study, which is basically the national version of the Minnesota Student Survey. So we are seeing a huge increase in the use of e-cigarettes. And part of that has to do with what I spoke about earlier relating to perception of harm. The belief is vaping or juuling is less harmful than smoking an actual cigarette. And so kids are more likely to participate in that activity. A few other things to note. This is specifically about Minnesota teen tobacco use. It has increased for the first time in 17 years. That was a downward trend for a long time. And where we see the increase is exclusively with vaping and e-cigarettes. It's not an increase in traditional cigarette smoking or use. And so that's a trend that we're certainly keeping our eyes on and wanting to look out for. So here's just a few examples of what e-cigarettes and Juuls look like. All of these are, let's see, we had a couple in the room. There's a few just up here that look like electronic cigarettes. This one here is considered a Juul. A lot of times Juuls look like thumb drives. Or flash drives, essentially. So they're really kind of hard to tell what's in there. And typically a Juul, there's on the lower right hand though, that's what a Juul looks like. Typically there's enough tobacco in there for 1 to 2 standard packs of cigarettes, not tobacco, nicotine. So you can also see here the sweatshirt, the drawstrings on the hood of the sweatshirt are actually used to vape. So that's even built into clothing. And then the top right hand or the top left hand looks like a car starter or a car fob, key fob, but that's also used to smoke e-cigarettes.
And some things that are a little bit dangerous with the e-cigs right now and the vaping is that with regular cigarettes, there's a lot of regulations regarding cigarette smoking. With vaping, there's not right now. It's just because it's new, they're starting all over. So we really don't know what's going to happen in the future with all of this vape going into the lungs. And, like Jessica talked about the perception of harm being less because it is a vape rather than the cigarette smoke. However, there still is formaldehyde. There still are carcinogens. There still are a lot of the same items that are in cigarette smoke in the vape.
So you've heard us say the word juuling a couple of times. And what is Juul? It's spelled J-U-U-L. That's actually a brand. It's the most common brand and the fastest growing brand of e-cigarettes and is the most popular with the youth age group. This company actually has a patent on including something called benzoic acid in their Juuls, which takes away the burn that you feel in your throat when you smoke, which makes it easier to smoke more, and which makes it feel like it's less harmful. And so this particular company has the largest market share of e-cigarettes in the country, and especially with our young people, and it's a company that's only about 3 years old. So it grew pretty fast in a short amount of time. This here is a graph that shows the sales, Juul's sales as a percentage of all e-cigarette sales. So when back maybe 2 years ago, it was only about a quarter, and now to October in the fall here, it was 75% of the sales. So growing very quickly and very popular amongst our kiddos. We're gonna shift a little bit of a gear here and talk a little bit about what do you do? What do you do if you're concerned? How do you help your community? And how do you help some of these kids stay safe? And the fact of the matter is, you can't do anything about a concern unless you know it exists, which is why all of you get gold stars for being here tonight. There may be an opportunity for you to look at something a little bit differently and potentially help somebody. I know one story we've heard pretty frequently from our kids in treatment is that where they got their prescription drugs was they would go to open houses for houses that were on the real estate market. And one person would go and talk to the realtor, another person would go to the bathroom, and they would empty out the cabinets and get pills from the homes of complete strangers. So you don't even need to have kids to potentially benefit from, just additional awareness about how people are accessing these drugs. But another thing that we hear very commonly when we do this presentation is that parents will say, I would never go into my kid's room. So they love this exhibit because they think, wow, it's an opportunity for me to go and look through a teenage bedroom. When most people have a teenage bedroom at home that they actually could look in, but really feel like that's their kid's space and don't ever participate in that environment. And so we want to challenge that thinking a little bit. If you happen to fall in that category, to really participate and engage in your kids' environment so that you can keep your eye out for some of these early warning signs so we can get kids redirected and get them the support that they need before it becomes too late. And that being said, the safety of our kids trumps their privacy. So I know you don't want to go home tonight and do a prison-style shakedown of your kids' room and flip their mattresses and throw things out the window. That's not productive either. But if participating in their environments helps keep them safe, it's worth it. One other thing to consider in addition to just a teen bedroom also is kind of keeping your eye out for what's happening in their car if they have a vehicle. I got a call, it was probably a year ago now, from a mother at a local school, probably about 10 minutes from here. And that day at her son's school, they had the K-9 unit there doing random drug searches, going through lockers and things of that nature. Her son pulled into the school parking lot while the K-9 unit happened to be outside, and immediately the unit hit on the car. The young man was charged with 3 felonies for possession, distribution, and I can't remember what the third one is, but he had multiple bongs in his car. He actually was operating a Bong of the Month club out of his vehicle, and then also selling pills and marijuana, and then also had some weapons and a few other things. And I talked to the mom on the phone for about an hour, and she said, I've gone through his room. I had no idea he was doing any of this, and I had never ever once thought to look in the trunk of his car. And so she felt that had she been a little bit more engaged in his environment, she could have potentially prevented what will forever change his life, regardless of kind of how those charges shook out for him. He ended up getting treatment, which is great news. But that's something that perhaps we could have seen earlier on and prevented something that potentially changed his life after that day at the school.
I'm going to read this for you. Years after the tragedy, I picked up a parenting magazine in a waiting room featuring an ethical parenting quiz. I got all 10 questions right except for, would you read your child's private journal? The correct answer, according to the parenting magazine, was no. I know it would have been my answer too when Dylan was alive, but it would not have been my answer now. When we search our children's rooms or read their journals, we risk that they will feel betrayed. However, they may be hiding problems they cannot manage themselves.
This was written by a woman named Sue Klebold in a book called A Mother's Reckoning. Does anybody know who Sue Klebold is? See a few head nods. Sue Klebold is the mother of Dylan Klebold. On April 20th, 1999, just about 20 years ago, entered Columbine High School and killed 12 of his classmates and staff in the school. This is a book that she wrote after that event. And in the book, it was really powerful. She really explored her grief as a mother who had lost her son, but also the guilt of being the mother of somebody who had caused that grief for so many other families. But she had a passage in there that really struck me. And it kind of started off with this, but she talked about how for several months after the Columbine school shooting, they were not allowed in their home while law enforcement investigated. Once they were finally allowed back in their home, it took her several more months before she could bring herself to enter his bedroom. Once she entered his bedroom, she found 2 things in there that she believes, had she found them before April 20th, 1999, she could have prevented what happened that day. Now, of course, hindsight is 20/20, right? But what did she find? First thing she found was in his dresser drawer. She found a pack of cigarettes. Why was that significant to her? It was significant because she had the suspicion for a long period of time that Dylan had been smoking, and she had asked him about it a number of times. She just sort of had that mom gut instinct. And every time she asked him about it, he denied it. And in fact, he got mad with her, frustrated. Mom, I can't believe you keep asking me about that. Smoking is gross. I would never do that. And so when she saw the pack of cigarettes, she really became aware, kind of for the first time with some clarity, how capable he was of keeping things from her when he wanted to. He was determined for her to not find that out. The second thing she found in his medicine cabinet. And she really kicked herself because she was a mother who went into her son's room. She would intentionally drop off his laundry or go in and ask what he wants for dinner, but she had never opened his medicine cabinet. What she found in his medicine cabinet was a bottle of something called St. John's wort. Does anybody know what that is? It's a natural remedy for depression. What that meant to her was that not only had her son been struggling with depression to the extent that he was trying to find a way to feel better, but that he had been struggling with it for so long that the bottle she found had long since been expired. She believes to this day that had she found that, she could have gotten him the help that she needed. Potentially, he'd still be with us, and who knows, the entire course of history could have been changed. And so, yes, this is an extreme example, but it's a very real example of a real mother who, by participating in the environment of her son, could have potentially impacted the opportunity to get him help. And so that's just something that we feel is important to share with all of you in a real life example. So here's just a few things. If you're concerned, if you think you potentially find something, what are some things you can do? First things first is to remain calm. I'm going to tell a real story here about my 17-year-old daughter, who a couple of weeks ago decided to do something stupid. And what she did was, well, actually, I'll tell you kind of how this all played out. She asked if she could go hang out with a couple of her friends. She's going to be gone for a couple of hours. So a couple of hours go by, or actually not a couple of hours, about half hour goes by and she comes back, and I thought, well, that's weird. She said a couple of hours, she's been gone only about a half hour. I wonder why that is. So I started to wonder, and she went straight upstairs when she got home, not come downstairs, and rather than coming to ask me when we were going to go to dinner, she texted me and asked me when we were going to go for dinner, and she said, I'm not sure if you're on a conference call for work, so I'm texting you. And again, I thought, okay, that's weird. This is a kid who doesn't really care if I'm on a conference call for work. I can be on the conference call with the president of the company, and she barges right in like it's nothing. So, okay, she was only gone for a half hour. She's texting me. Also, I noticed something very strange and atypical for teenagers. All of her words were appropriately capitalized with the appropriate punctuation, and there was no abbreviations. So what that told me was this was a speech to text rather than a text. So I thought, okay, that's also interesting. So I texted her and I said, why don't you come down here? Came down there, I knew immediately she was high. Could tell right by the look in her eyes. How bloodshot her eyes were, the way she was acting, I knew she was high. Now, she has come with me to our treatment center since she was little. She knows what it's like, she knows what it's all about. I've worked there for 14 years since she was 3 years old. And rather than immediately flying off the handle, I thought, okay, not sure when we're going to go to dinner. I'll call you. And she kind of thought that was weird, but left and thought, okay, maybe I got away with this. So what I did was stayed calm, took a few breaths, and thought about it for a little bit. And that's really important because fear can take over in those moments, and we can lose the opportunity to have some really important communication with our kids if they're struggling. And so another important thing for me in that moment was to be her parent and not her friend. Because our kids have the opportunity to have hundreds of friends in their lifetime, but they only will have 1 or 2, or in a few cases, 3 or 4 parents who are going to look out for their best interests and help keep them safe and help them build that prefrontal cortex to make smart choices into adulthood. And so it was important that I played that role of her parent and keeping her safe and appropriately managing the situation. So we'll go through, I'll reference this a little bit more here as we go, but a couple of other things that you can do is create an open environment, listen to your child, share your own values. One thing that we know for sure is that kids pay more attention to what we say than we think they do. I know one of my favorite moments as a parent is when my kids will come to me and say, hey, do you remember that time when you said, and I'm like, what? You were even listening to me? I had no idea you were listening to me. But they do hear us, and if we're not sharing with them our values and expectations around alcohol or drug use as minors, they're not necessarily going to hear it from any place else. And so make sure you're sharing your values. In fact, I think it was Detective Maloney maybe that had the statistic of 80% of our kids believe that their parents should have a say in whether or not they use drugs or alcohol. So that should be a family conversation and something that we're having ongoing discussions about. I know one of the things that concerns me a lot is I get questions at events like this for parents that come up and say, well, I know it's a little too young to worry about my kid yet, but when should I start talking to them? I say, well, how old is your kid? And they say 16. I can tell you most of the kids that come into treatment with us have started using typically between ages 10 and 12, but oftentimes as young as 7 or 8. So you want to have these ongoing conversations throughout their childhood at age-appropriate points in their life to make sure they're getting repeated messaging from parents. So here's a few things. What can you do? We've talked about investigating. That's why we kind of wanted to give you the opportunity to go through the room and just see with your blind eye if there's anything that stood out for you. This isn't a prison-style shakedown. For me, it's as simple as rather than texting my kids and asking them what they want on their pizza, it's walking into their room and kind of looking around and seeing if anything looks out of place or if anything smells kind of strange, but just being in their environment and being present so that if there are things that might indicate the need for an intervention, that you can certainly help them do that. Let's see, educate yourself on the issues. All of you get an A+ for that tonight. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to this information. It's really important, and the more people that have this information, the more we can support our community. Another thing is eliminate or reduce access. If you're saying, I want to go home tonight and I want to do one thing that will make a difference, the one thing you should do is eliminate or reduce access to drugs or alcohol in your home. If you have prescription medications that you use, lock them up, even if you don't have children. The number one place that our kids get the prescription medications that they take is in their parents' home. The number 2 place that they get it is in the homes of their friends. So you don't even need to have children for that to be a risk. The other thing you can do is that there are 2 drop boxes in the city of Bloomington. One is at the Walgreens on 98th and Lyndale, and one is at Health Partners on, I have it on a later slide, I'll pull that up, where if you have unused prescriptions that you're not going to take, rather than flushing them down the toilet, you can take them to both of those locations and get rid of them so they can be destroyed, so they're not there as a potential hazard for somebody that might be in your home. So a few things. How do you set boundaries and clear expectations? Here's just a few tips to kind of keep our healthy kids healthy, right? Because that's overall the goal. You want to set a curfew and stay awake. If you set a curfew and go to sleep, you have no idea if your kids got home on time or what kind of condition they're in. So that's really important. You want to talk to other parents. I can also tell you every time we do this presentation, we have parents that come up to us and say, you know, I just feel like I'm the only parent that has these rules, and I feel like every time my kid goes to somebody else's house, it's just going to be a party. But I can tell you based on the number of parents that come to us and say that, there's a lot of parents out there that have the same concerns, but we're not talking to each other necessarily. So it requires us to work together. Another big one, and I could go off on a whole nother tangent about this, is disallowing overnight phone use. One of my topics of passion is teen technology use. So that's another presentation that I do. But as my dad used to say when I was growing up, when he was giving me my curfew, there's nothing that happened at 2 in the morning that I needed to be a part of. So of course, you know, I had to be home. But the same is true online. There's nothing that's happening on Snapchat at 2 in the morning that our kids need to be a part of. Not only are they engaging in unsafe behaviors on their phones, but it's dramatically disrupting their sleep cycle, which is making them more likely to have things like depression and anxiety, and to struggle in school, and a whole number of other issues. And so, again, if there's one thing that you can do to kind of have a protective factor for keeping our kids healthy, that would be to make sure you're taking phones at bedtime. I will also tell you that kids will tell you, you can't take my phone, I need an alarm clock, that's how I wake up in the morning. And so to that I will say, send me an email and I will give you an alarm clock, because they can absolutely, I have one of those ones for my daughter that rolls off her nightstand and onto the floor that she physically has to get up and pick up. It's the only way she'll wake up otherwise. She hates it, I love it, it works out. A few other things, make it easy to leave a party. For us, the code word is X. If I get a text message with the letter X on it, I go immediately to where my girls are and pick them up. I don't ask questions. It's not the time for a lecture. It's not the time to shame and blame. It's the time to get them safe, because they're showing maturity and the ability to make healthy choices by reaching out and asking for help. I typically find that they do want to talk about it, but that is one thing that can be really helpful. Another big one is outline reasonable consequences and follow through. We have to set expectations as parents, and we have to mean it. So if I say you have to make your bed every day this week in order to get your $20 allowance, and then they make their bed no days and they still get their allowance, are they really going to believe me when I say my expectation is you don't use marijuana, you don't drink underage, et cetera, et cetera? They're going to challenge whether or not I actually mean it. So it's actually more harmful to set an expectation and not follow through than it is to not set expectations at all. Lastly, I'll just talk about listening to your instincts. That was kind of the purpose of my story with my daughter. There were 3 things that I thought, this is not like her. Something's up and I need to figure it out. And so I listened to my instinct rather than brushing it off, because it would have been really easy for me to talk myself out of that. Oh, she's tired. Oh, she didn't feel like walking down the stairs. Oh, everything's fine. But we have instincts for a reason. And so if you feel like something's off, investigate. Look into it. Ask for help. Talk to somebody and see if you can figure out what might be going on. That being said, we want to remind you that most of our kids are engaging in healthy behaviors, and most of our kids feel good about their future. Most of our kids are healthy and happy and doing wonderful things. And there are some kids who are struggling too, and there are resources for help and support for those kiddos and for those families that are affected by this. So keep that in mind. We want to keep our healthy kids healthy. That's a big goal of ours, but also to provide the services more quickly to those at some point who may need them. Lastly, I just want to follow up with a few resources, and we'll kind of jump into a Q&A here. The website that I mentioned earlier, topsecretproject.org, is up there. There's a few other websites up here, drugabuse.gov, teensdrugabuse.gov, or a few other websites that have some great information, tools, tips and tricks, statistics that are really helpful. And then the drop boxes that I talked about, Walgreens on 98th and Lindale, and Health Partners in Bloomington on 86th and Nicollet. Both will do drug takebacks. And then twice a year there's National Drug Takeback Day, where there's a lot of publicity around it to remind people to do that. In addition, we have services across the board that support families who are impacted by addiction and mental health issues. And so if you know somebody who's struggling, feel free to give them our contact information or encourage them to reach out, because there's no reason for those who are struggling to continue to struggle, because there is absolutely the opportunity to help people get better, and we see it every day, which is why we do the work that we do. A lot of people say, isn't it hard working in a treatment center with a bunch of teenagers? And you know what? I love it. Every day I walk through the hallway and see people who are changing their lives for the better and making really healthy choices. And so for that, it's really powerful. I think with that, I'm gonna end and we're gonna start the Q&A. And we got an early taker. A number of them are on the handouts out here. But also you can grab, I know Cindy's business card is out there. Mm-hmm. If you want to email us, we'd be happy to send you the slide and get it out to you. Yep, that'd be pretty easy. We take all private insurance, no state-funded insurance, unfortunately. We do offer scholarships. I can tell you most of our treatment programs, we can bill through insurance. Unfortunately, the Connection program is not considered a clinical service. It's traditionally for parents who are struggling and families who have concerns, but they're not really sure what to do. And so that one isn't billable to insurance. But we also have some other local community resources that we work with that oftentimes do some community support work too, free of charge or at a dramatic discount for families that are struggling, just because it's so important to help families provide resources when they have needs. Thank you. Other questions? I know we've got Detective Maloney up here too that would be happy to answer questions specific to this community or things that we see here. Yes.
On the electronics cigarettes, can you put other drugs other than nicotine into that device?
That's a great question, and the answer is absolutely yes. Any drug that can be smoked can be used through most versions of an e-cigarette. Some of them, the way they're constructed, are a little bit harder to use with other chemicals. But is that something that you see?
Yeah, you'll see that much more frequently with these types here, where there's basically a cartridge that you screw in and pull out. So you can go to any tobacco shop and you will find every flavor under the sun. You know, you'll have the mango pineapple flavored nicotine based, and it will basically be a clear capsule with kind of a yellowish or tannish kind of oil that's inside of there. And the difference between that and a THC based cartridge, to the naked eye, it'll look the exact same thing. It'll literally be or mango pineapple, but will have a THC content of anywhere from 80 to 90%. So prior in those slides where we're talking about the potency of marijuana now is 14%, I've heard as high as 30% in really high-end strains. Those percentages in these THC cartridges will be as high as 90%. So it's extremely potent stuff. It's not your dad's or your grandfather's marijuana anymore. This is some very potent stuff.
She asked, where would you get the oil for THC?
Absolutely, you could. I mean, the honest answer is the internet. I mean, you can buy anything on the internet. I think that's the way that the vast majority of people make contacts, and they'll make contacts through social networking sites or different online forums, or they'll make contact with somebody that has access to a legal quantity of those in, say, Colorado, and they will say, this is my address, I will send you $300, send me 15 of those cartridges. The THC cartridges they're selling on the street for approximately $20 a piece. They're very inexpensive.
Also, what kids are doing is they're making marijuana wax, which can be as potent as 90%, up to 90% pure THC. It causes psychosis, and what we see in our treatment center, and we've heard from people around the community that when they are using this and using the pure, almost pure THC, it takes 2 to 3 weeks sometimes to get out of psychosis. But it can be this marijuana wax that they make. You can make it from using like a flat iron, parchment paper, the marijuana bud. They heat it up and they scrape off the marijuana THC on the parchment paper, and that's marijuana wax. So I mean, and a lot of times they make it with butane too. So and if you want to know how to make it, YouTube it. And that's the danger of YouTube.
I think you mentioned before about the Carmex containers or the lip balm
Yes,
containers.
yes.
That's what the similarity is in appearance to butane hash oil or wax or shatter, as they would call it.
Right.
It honestly looks like earwax or like Carmex, or that kind of viscous kind of tannish color to it, and it will look almost exactly like Carmex.
Yep. And the harder it is, the more concentrated it is. So like when you talk about things like shatter, it's typically more concentrated than something that is more of a gummy, gooey consistency.
I was just wondering what you see for trends, if you could talk about trends in Bloomington, high schools and middle schools, and maybe how, if you go into the schools and talk to the kids.
We do frequently, actually. I'm involved with a program that's called Change the Outcome. It's the executive director is a lady named Colleen Ronnie, whose son passed away from a drug overdose a couple of years ago. So she's the executive director. She developed the programming. I go as a panelist, almost similar to this forum, where I kind of have unique insights that are focused related to Bloomington. But in the city of Bloomington, every 8th grade and every 10th grade health class sees us for the duration of that class. So it's a short period. It's very condensed. It's 45 minutes to an hour. But we've spoken to, I would guess, over 1,000 kids this school year. Literally every 8th grade and 10th grade kid has seen a program and has seen me this year. So if any of you guys have a 8th or 10th grade kid, ask them about that handsome detective with the beard that came and talked to them. Let me know if he was good or not, and give me the feedback. So, we get out there and we're absolutely interested, and we want to make sure that we're talking to kids. But like we discussed briefly, in my opinion, honestly, 8th grade and 10th grade is a little bit too late. I have a 9-year-old son, an 11-year-old son, and my 9-year-old son and 11-year-old son have had conversations about what drugs are. I've made it clear as to what my expectations are, and I think that's important that we have that discussion probably a couple years before you think you should have those discussions. So to answer your question as far as what we're seeing with adolescents, these e-cigarettes is extremely consistent. The things that I'm, I guess, more concerned about is things like Adderall. The generic name or the chemical compound as to what Adderall is amphetamine salts. It's almost the exact same as methamphetamine, which hopefully you guys have heard of before, a street drug. It's literally the same thing. Very good and normal for people that have ADD or ADHD, but for those that don't have that diagnosis, it's almost the same as ingesting a methamphetamine pill. It's literally almost the exact same thing. So, pressed pills, Xanax, oxycodone, hydrocodone, those are the things that I'm concerned about with my kids. Hopefully that answers your question.
Detective Maloney, will you talk a little bit about the Bloomington stats and what you see in regard to like drug use here?
We were actually kind of discussing it before the presentation started here tonight. There's been a significant increase in opioids, opiates, heroin, fentanyl, which is kind of, I guess the quick way to explain it is super heroin. Fentanyl also has a medical purpose. Fentanyl is used for people typically in hospice care. Those are for people that have, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and they're going to more than likely pass away in the next couple weeks. They give them fentanyl to make them comfortable before they pass away. Unfortunately, drug dealers now are buying quantities of heroin, mixing it with lactose, which is an inert chemical to increase their yield. And then because the potency has been diminished, they'll add fentanyl to it, powder fentanyl to it. So my concern and the thing that I think is dangerous is that if I was to theoretically have 100 grams of heroin, add 100 grams of lactose, which is basically baby formula to it, I now have 200 grams of heroin, but now the potency is so low, I'm going to add a couple sprinkles of fentanyl to it, literally, a couple grains of rice. I'm going to mix that up and I'm going to start making baggies. The chances that bag number 1 and bag number 275 have the exact same amount of fentanyl in it, that's a consistent dose. These people are not scientists, they're not working in a lab. That's the part that I think is super scary. For me, being a father, you just don't know what you're getting, honestly.
Do you see carfentanil at all in this market?
We talk about it, we're aware of it. So for those that don't know, carfentanil is, you guys may have seen in the news or on a story. Carfentanil was designed 30, 40 years ago as a veterinarian tranquilizer for literally like elephants and bears and tigers. They'd shoot them with some carfentanil, and they would pass out, and then they could clip their toenails or whatever they do to elephants, I guess. But the potency is, I think it's like
10 times stronger than fentanyl.
Right, and so fentanyl is already 100 to 500 times more. So it's the analogy that I have is that if I was to take the equivalent of 2 grains of rice of carfentanil, mix it into 50 dosage units for the audience here today, and we were all to ingest it, the chances that probably 90% of us would overdose from that is very high. Mm-hmm. That is, scary.
We see it a lot from our kids that come to us from the East Coast. So because we get kids from all over the country, we see some of the trends that are on either the East or West Coast. So that's something that we see in particular pockets, depending on where our kids are coming from.
Where are these things coming from?
The short answer is, honestly, China. They don't have the regulation. They basically are shipping cargo containers full of fentanyl, carfentanil, and all kinds of controlled substances into Mexico, and then they would have traditional routes of supply into the United States.
And then kids often too are accessing the dark web, which Jessica can talk about a little bit more too, but it's an area that you've probably heard of the term Bitcoin. They're purchasing a lot of these, so anonymity, so they don't have any credit cards on file and things like that. So they're purchasing the drugs through that. And because a lot of people are accessing it, the cost of the drugs has gone drastically down. And so they're getting more drugs for less money, and they're getting away with it because of the Bitcoin and things like that.
Yeah, essentially the dark web is the part of the internet that's not, it's not indexed by Google. You can't Google the dark web and get there. It requires special overlays and software and access to get to, and it's used exclusively for human trafficking, drug and weapon trade, and a bunch of other illegal gambling and things of that nature.
Sex trafficking.
Yep. So there's that's one way, and kids know their IT, they know their technology, and if they're not sure how to access the dark web, they know how to figure out how to access the dark web, and so that's a very common place too where people are getting some of the drugs that they take.
Could I have Tom respond to one question? I think the audience would be interested in hearing. So, as a part of the Change the Outcome, we've heard Colleen Ronnie's story quite a bit. Can you explain to the audience how someone, whether it's a child or an adult, might go from prescription, or how quickly they might go from a prescription to heroin?
Yeah, I guess real quick, and I hope I guess I'm confident that Colleen wouldn't mind me with trying to generally summarize what her story was. But her son Luke passed away a little bit more than 3 years ago. He was, I think he was around 20, 21 years old. He was a student at Arizona State University. Good, outgoing kid. And maybe about a year before that or so, he had oral surgery, and he was prescribed hydrocodone or oxycodone, some type of painkiller. He unfortunately developed dry sockets after that tooth extraction, went back to the doctor, and it was very painful, and they prescribed an additional quantity of painkillers, oxycodone or hydrocodone, whichever it was. And based on, just like we talked about in the presentation before, it's very common for people to become mentally, emotionally, psychologically, and physically dependent on those opiates. That eventually, once that supply of opioids is removed, their transition is to something that's almost the exact same thing, which is heroin. So they go from pills that they can't access legitimately anymore, and they have the understanding that it's literally the same thing. It's not like your brain uses a needle and shoots heroin into your body, and your brain goes, this is the bad, scary heroin that I've seen in the TV or the movies, and this, the oxycodone or the hydrocodone that I ingested, this is the okay, good heroin. This is the stuff that I got from a doctor or a pharmacist. Your brain doesn't know any different. And so the exact same process goes, that when you remove that access to that drug, you find one that's pretty darn similar. I think it's important for you guys to understand the difference too, or I guess the insight that I have is that people that are addicted to opioids, they don't necessarily continue to use the drug because they're trying to get high. They're continue to use the drug to try and get well. And what I mean by that is that the withdrawal symptoms, and these guys can talk about this for hours and hours, I'm sure. The withdrawal symptoms are so painful that it's almost like if you were to take the flu, multiply it by 100, and then have that consistent until you were able to induce or bring your medication into your body, which is opiates or opioids, that would continue for days and days. I personally can't fathom how painful and terrible that would be, but there's not a lot of things that I probably wouldn't do if I had the flu times 100 for a week straight. And I think if we're being honest with each other, you guys would probably agree that you'd be in the same boat with me. So, yeah, it's scary. I don't know if that generally answered your question, Chief, or not, but.
Yeah, that's one of the shifts that can happen when somebody becomes dependent. Is originally if you're abusing a substance for the intention of getting high, you're doing it to feel better. But at some point, that sort of shifts to where you're now taking the drug to just feel normal again. So it stops having this positive effect to where you're feeling sort of this euphoria, and now you're taking it to maintain some sort of normal, so you don't feel that intense sickness that can happen when you're going through withdrawal. So it really is kind of this metamorphosis that takes place over the course of somebody's time using medications.
Yes.
Does drug use go hand in hand with eating disorder?
Does drug use go hand in hand with eating disorder?
Say that last part again?
Does it,
Drug use go hand in hand with eating disorders, and if so, which one starts first?
So that's a great question. The question is, does drug use go hand in hand with eating disorders, and if so, which one starts first? So hand in hand, not necessarily. There's a high statistical correlation that if you have an eating disorder, you're more likely to have a substance use disorder than the general population. If you have a substance use disorder, you're more likely to have an eating disorder than the general population. So we see a lot of kiddos coming into our treatment center in particular that also have a co-occurring eating disorder. Sometimes drugs can be used to help manage weight or eating disorder. So if they're trying to lose weight, for example, certain drugs will speed up metabolisms, give them more energy to do more physical activity, reduce appetite. So it can very much support their eating disorder and vice versa. So one thing that we oftentimes see with kids is once we take away their drugs and they're in treatment, sort of that predisposition can shift to something else, whether it's over-exercising or an eating disorder or something of the, gambling.
Sex addiction.
Anything of that nature. So once you have one issue, you're more likely to have other issues that you're dealing with. But there is no which one came first. We've seen it go both ways in equal amounts. People that have eating disorders that then develop a substance use disorder because somehow they're utilizing drugs or medication to manage their eating disorder, or vice versa. And so it's something that we absolutely see. And for that reason, we have mental health services and eating disorder services within our treatment program because the co-occurrence of the two together are so high. We also see a high rate of self-harm, cutting, things like that, and other mental health issues. The number 2 mental health diagnoses that we see in treatment are anxiety as number 1 and depression as number 2. And so some of that lends itself to the conversation about self-medicating. Sometimes our kids or adults too have anxiety or depression or other mental health issues to the extent where they're desperate to feel better, and so they're turning to different drugs to try to improve their mood or sort of increase their overall belief of well-being. And so those go very hand in hand as well.
Yes.
One sec.
As to what a synthetic drug is, a synthetic drug?
So the question is, what is a synthetic drug? Do you want to take that one?
Yes. Maybe you guys can correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that basically a natural derivative, things like heroin or morphine, those are what are actually called opiates. And then synthetic or semi-synthetic drugs such as oxycodone, hydrocodone, Oxycontin, things like that, those are semi-synthetic or synthetic drugs. Is that what you were asking, or did you? I guess what I mean by naturally occurring. So for like morphine and heroin, it's a manufacturing process that starts from an opiate, from a poppy. They basically lace the poppy. It milks out kind of a white substance. They then combine that with other chemicals and a firing process to kind of manufacture heroin, whereas things like oxycodone, hydrocodone, those are made in a lab. Those are synthetic or semi-synthetic substances.
Yeah, just to add to that, like as you talk about naturally occurring, there's naturally occurring marijuana, and then there's synthetic marijuana, or something called K2 or spice. And the chemical makeup of synthetic drugs is changing constantly, partly as it relates to regulation around those chemicals. But there's a belief that because they're lab created, even though we use the term lab very loosely there, that they're perhaps less harmful than some of the naturally occurring drugs that exist. When in fact we see a higher rate of occurrence for psychosis for people who are using synthetic drugs. So psychosis that can accompany synthetic drug use, regardless of whether it's bath salts or K2 or any of these other things, is very distinguishable compared to many of the other drugs that we see. And so there's some very clear presentation that we get with kids who are using synthetics, and oftentimes that might be what kids are purchasing online. I know on the screen that we had the 5 kids on, there was a kid on there named Alex from Chanhassen who died. He ordered synthetic drugs on the dark web from China, and ultimately took those, and several hours later passed away. And so there's no regulation on those either. And for that reason, that's part of why they're pretty dangerous.
Some of the feedback that we've gotten from individuals that have taken the synthetic marijuana are they feel like they're burning from the inside out. So quite frequently, if you see somebody that is overdosing on a synthetic drug, they'll be naked running around or in a pool of water to try to cool off, and in psychosis.
I had received a question that says, are there limits to the number of opioid prescribed by doctors? Is it like 6 or 40, or how does that work with doctors?
That's a great question. I know there's been some efforts in this area to help control prescriptions. I know that doctors across the board have received a lot more education in the last few years about prescribing opiates. So where historically you might have seen a prescription for 30 hydrocodone because you had a wisdom tooth taken out, now you're more commonly seeing doctors writing a prescription for 6 or 10 pills because typically that pain is really only unbearable for 24 to 48 hours. So there's been some education that's happened there in general. There's also a prescription drug registry that, from what I understand, and maybe you know differently, but is optional at this point. And so certain doctors and pharmacies will record prescription medications by person, so that if somebody is doctor shopping or pharmacy shopping, where they're going from pharmacy to pharmacy and doctor to doctor to try to get prescriptions, one control mechanism they have is to check the prescription drug registry to see, okay, that person's gotten, opioids from the last 5 people in a month. This is obviously not somebody that we want to prescribe to, but I don't think that's mandated as of yet.
Yeah, I believe it is. It's called the Prescription Monitoring Program, and we can access the same information. We have to have a search warrant to access that information, but if theoretically we have somebody that comes in and they're arrested on the street because they had 15 hydrocodone pills in their pocket or in their vehicle or something like that, and they say, I have a prescription for it, and I say, well, can you bring me the prescription? And they never show up to bring me the prescription. I can write a search warrant to the Prescription Monitoring Program. They will give me information for the past couple of years, and I'll be able to show that he's never been prescribed hydrocodone or oxycodone or whatever, and then we can charge them for that possession crime. So, I think doctors and pharmacies are really good at doing that stuff now. I think that's been around for a couple of years now, and I think they do a nice job with that. So they're absolutely taking steps to I think that if you talk to people that are involved with the medical side of substance abuse, or doctors that were prescribing a heck of a lot of hydrocodone and oxycodone, most of them are pretty honest about it. Say, hey, I mean, we were kind of sold a bill of goods by a lot of these big pharmacies and companies that were pushing the stuff out that told us that it was safe, and unfortunately, they have some role in of responsibility with the problem that we have, as do I think all of us. But talking about the frequency of prescription stuff, I was looking at an article a couple days ago, and I'm pretty sure Florida just passed a law recently where they can only prescribe 3 days worth of painkillers, and I think that probably comes from a lot of studies that have showed that after 3 days, your brain chemistry starts to kind of rewire itself towards a dependence for those painkillers. So it happens relatively quick.
And that's great, because Florida was one of the biggest places where we were getting prescription drugs from in other areas of the country, because it was being prescribed so much in that particular market that they called them, was it pill farms or?
Pill mills.
Pill mills, thank you. Where the doctors were just prescribing for no particular reason. So we've seen definitely a shift in some of that.
You may have already covered some of this, but there's a lot of effort right now at the state level to legalize marijuana at both the medicinal and recreational levels. Where do you see this ending up in terms of your programs and the net effect of this on our kids, on our society, and so on and so forth?
That's a great question. I think I'd start by saying one thing that we touched on earlier, which is perception of harm, influences the likelihood of use. And so if it becomes legalized in the state of Minnesota or decriminalized, we will likely see a related increase in use of that particular drug because it's perceived as less harmful. But another thing that dramatically influences whether or not a young person uses is ease of access. And so right now, while marijuana is still fairly easy to get, having it legalized or decriminalized is making it that much more accessible for young people. And so the top two things that determine prevention for young people would be put at risk through legalization. And part of the reason why marijuana or any substance is so harmful for young people in particular is because of the state that the adolescent brain is in and the fact that it's not fully developed. Substances and mood-altering chemicals impact brain development. And if you begin using substances to intoxication before the age of 15, you're 4 times more likely to develop a substance use disorder in your lifetime than if you delay that until older age, regardless of the chemical, where your brain is more fully developed. So that's been a concern of ours, is the impact that this will have in particular on young people and the potential change to sort of the brain chemistry and the vulnerability that they have to addiction. My prediction is, because we see more and more states going towards decriminalization, that ultimately that will probably be something that happens in the state of Minnesota, and we will see some of the same trends that have happened in other areas like Washington and California and Colorado. Here in terms of an increase in ER admissions due to things like edibles and other things. But there's some other potential benefits on the other side of it too that are argued very ferociously as well. So it's an ongoing conversation right now. And do either of you have anything to add to that?
No, not at this point. Thanks.
I'll use this one. So law enforcement will enforce whatever the law is. So we're not going to weigh in too strongly, at least tonight, on what we think. Is it a good law? Is it a bad law? Our job will be to enforce whatever the law is. But there are about 3 things that I think people should really know before you form your own solid opinion on whether or not recreational marijuana is good or bad. One was referenced here, the THC levels that they're seeing in edibles and other things are a lot higher than what people think they are. And so you are seeing in states where recreational marijuana has been legalized is massive increases in ER visits. People that don't realize how strong it is, they're unable to kind of function, and so they're having to go in and do ER visits. Number 2, it's really difficult when someone's driving to determine what's that point of inebriation. With alcohol, we've got a long history of being able to test blood alcohol concentrations, and so now the law is 0.08. Anybody with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.08 or higher shouldn't be driving, and there's a lot of science to back that up. There is currently no roadside test for THC or for marijuana. So what we're also seeing in states where there's been legalization is a pretty significant spike in car crashes that are attributed to marijuana use. Fatalities have increased drastically in these states. Car crashes have increased drastically in these states. A lot of people are getting hurt. And so there is no roadside test. It's really hard for the officers to be able to determine whether or not they smoked the marijuana 15 minutes ago or 5 days ago. So we need a roadside test to really determine what's that point of inebriation and when can somebody safely drive a vehicle after ingesting marijuana, whether it's edible or smoking. Number 3 is there's a belief that if you legalize marijuana, you'll really kind of get rid of the black market. That's not true. We're finding out in states where they have legalized marijuana that the black market is alive and well. There's money to be made. It's legal, and so you don't have to hide it as much. And so sure, there are tax dollars to be made by whatever states are legalizing it, but it doesn't get rid of the black market, and our narcotics folks that are responsible for enforcing it still have to go out and spend a ton of energy to try to figure out really where's this marijuana coming from. The marijuana can be very similar to what's grown in a recreationally legal state, but the black market is alive and well, and that creates a lot of problems for law enforcement. So do your own research on it. I urge you to. There are those things that I just mentioned, but there's all kinds of other information online.
Right.
Obviously, we're concerned about it, but if the law changes in Minnesota, we're just going to have to deal with it, and and law enforcement will react accordingly.
Yeah, that was very well stated. Thank you.
Question over here?
So, do they ever pull you guys in when they're making these laws and have you guys talk to them?
And do you mean law enforcement, treatment, all of the above?
All of you guys, do they ever
Yeah.
pull you guys in, the people, and talk to them?
I can speak for us on the treatment side. They don't ever pull us in. We bring ourselves there. And we actually have a whole Department of Public Advocacy where we work both at the state and the national level to help influence policy change around things like marijuana and opiates and a number of other related topics. And so I know for our organization and the mission of the work that we do, that's an important part, is educating and being involved in legislative activity to make sure that they're making decisions with sort of all of the information rather than just one side or the other. I don't know about law.
And law enforcement was involved this year. Just as a quick update, the bill was brought forward in the House, and ultimately there was an amendment brought forward to basically form a group to study it for a year. The Senate did not take it up this year. They were opposed to it. And so I guess what could happen this year is they'll actually form this group and study some of the things I just mentioned, actually, because we had law enforcement. There's a lot of people that have kind of seen this in other states that were willing to come forward and speak to the pros and cons of it here. A guy by the name of Dale Quigley, if you Googled that and see Dale Quigley's presentation that he made at our Minnesota House committee hearing this year, he spoke about a lot of the same things I did. So yes, law enforcement is at the table. But as it goes for this year right now, I think the most that you'll see is if this bill goes forward to form a task force to study it. That's probably about as far as it's going to go this year. Although anything could happen, I guess, down the stretch in the committee hearings and things. But I think about as far as we're going to go this year is to have a year of study, and then next year it might come back again for more discussion.
Yep. Any other questions? Did anybody? Yeah, go ahead.
You're talking about the law enforcement part. How about the problem with, you make marijuana legal or sold on the black market? This is all sold for large amounts of cash. What kind of problem do you have with places that sell this stuff having a lot of cash on hand where people try to kill or steal it from each other? Is that a big problem for you?
I guess.
I've heard of one.
Yeah, no, I do know that the banking system is not in support or doesn't that they had to make I think co-op banks, right, for growers and people that were involved in distribution at these marijuana retail locations. Because as much as your state law may change, it's still illegal in the federal system. Federal law, it's illegal. It's a Schedule I controlled substance, and that's super complex stuff that I would much rather have the chief explain or talk about policy type stuff, because I don't want to step on my own foot with that type of stuff. But
I got to
yeah,
for another state.
Okay.
Just in their version of the FBI.
right,
That's the biggest problem they have.
yeah,
Yeah.
Because of
you're right. There's
Colorado, but the people that are bringing it in, it's all cash money.
absolutely there's a tremendous amount of cash that's associated with that. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, I think Tom's done a good job here. I think in the states where it's legal, there are robberies that happen because this is a cash business. And that's probably more prevalent, though, in the black market that exists for marijuana. We are aware that in some states where it's been legalized, they have been able to, the manufacturers have gotten involved and really have created their own kind of ATM systems at these dispensaries or at these locations where they're selling. And so it's not exclusively and entirely cash. There are kind of self-funded ATM systems that have kind of caught on in some of these states, and so it's not exclusively cash now. There are some places that are accepting debit or ATM, debit cards, or have other devices that can use credit cards.
But there's still a lot of problems that can spill over onto us innocent people.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's one of the concerns, especially when you consider it doesn't lead to an environment where there is no black market. And so where there's a black market, there's no control over the pricing, there's no control over the quality, and we all know what happens sometimes when drug dealers have clients that don't pay them, and we have fights, and there's also other activity that happens in that black market that leads to violence. So absolutely, it's a problem.
Speaking of technology, one thing that we've seen an increase in, I just read an article on this, is have any of you heard of Venmo or other money sharing apps? Venmo is where you can just transfer money from one person to the next if you hook up your bank account. There's been an increase in utilizing apps like that to pay for drugs, and so increasingly more and more of these transactions are taking place through smart devices or apps such as that. So that's one thing that we'll kind of probably continue to see shift and change the marketplace kind of all across the board.
Can you speak to the concept of marijuana being like the gateway drug, and what does the data show about that?
That's a great question. There's a little bit of controversy around whether or not marijuana is a gateway drug and kind of gateway drugs in general. I can just tell you from statistically what we see in our population of kids at our treatment center is that most of our kids don't start off using meth or heroin. They're typically utilizing or experimenting with other substances, whether it's prescription medication or marijuana or even nicotine or alcohol, before they transition into harder drugs, so to speak. And so on the treatment side of things, we tend to see a fairly common progression where they start with some of the substances that are perceived as less harmful, prescription drugs or even over-the-counter medications in some cases, and sort of work their way up the chain, especially as that brain chemistry starts to shift in younger people. That makes them more vulnerable to addiction. So we do see that, but there is a little bit of mixed science and research on the notion of gateway. So I don't know if you have any other thoughts about that from your side, but.
Yeah, no, I sort of cringe a little bit when I hear the term gateway, because
Yeah.
it makes it sound like it's a causation. Like if you smoke marijuana, eventually you're going to use heroin or methamphetamine. There's
Right.
obviously a correlation to it. In my opinion, not significantly more of a correlation than it is with nicotine or tobacco or whatever. I mean, once young people start engaging in risky behaviors and start making decisions that are not healthy for them, the chance that they're going to make a worse decision down the road is astronomical. So.
Yeah.
So I find myself pondering this a little bit while I'm sitting here. So one of the things that you said was that one of your fears is the prescription meds in the home, and
Yeah.
and then you mentioned, one of the big things we have to take home is access. Lock your meds up. But I think that the age that you're saying some of the kids start this, that's just about the time that some of us who are thinking our kids will never do that, we're trusting them to start taking meds on their own. Sometimes even including the ADHD or the cough medicine or and so can you speak to that? Because we're trying to also encourage some decision making and independence, and they've had all the drug training at school and from their mothers and fathers, and yet we know that those are also the kids that start to change the use of them, or their friends, they start giving them to the. So can you just speak to that? How do we decide on the accessibility issue?
I think I'll just start off. I think for me, it kind of goes to that trust but verify.
I was just going to say the same thing.
You want to teach your kids to have independence
Yeah.
and to sort of start managing some of those things on their own. And I think that's really important. But if you have a kid who sprained their ankle, who got 30 days supply of Oxy, and the next day come home and they have none, because guess what? A bunch of kids offered to buy it off of them at school. That would be something that, just simply checking in and saying, okay, where are you at with your meds? Let me check the bottle. Let me just make sure that the right amount of pills are in there at the right time, to make sure not only are they not getting rid of it in some way, but that they're actually taking it too. I think is really important to kind of help teach them those independent skills, but to make sure something else isn't happening that could be potentially harmful. I think that's the approach that I take as a parent, just to say, I want you to have ownership of this and to know how to manage this on your own. And I'm going to be checking in.
And my advice is just to advocate for yourself and for your kid. When you go to the doctor, if your kid sprains their ankle at basketball or they break their wrist at gymnastics, make sure you talk to the doctor and say, this medication you're prescribing, is there any bad side effects? Is there any possibility of addiction, or is there any possibility of whatever? And if the answer is, well, yeah, kinda, then be very careful with it. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that painkillers may be necessary for that short acute symptoms, that extreme pain for those first couple days, but then aspirin, ibuprofen, Motrin is as effective or very similar in that time afterwards. So, be very, very careful when your doctor prescribes you 30 days worth of hydrocodone, because there's a chance that even good intentioned people would have an issue with it. It's just basic brain chemistry and physical dependence on it.
Yeah,
it's
I
not a
think
choice.
I think there's certain medications that the school will require you to turn over to the nurse's office for management while kids are in school, just for the potential risk. And I think Adderall is a great example of that. So even though the young person may be at an age where they can manage that themselves, the schools are asking for parents to provide the medication to the nurse, so that when it's time for that person to get their medication, that it's being managed that way. So certain drugs I probably would stay a lot more actively involved in than if it was just, a leave for cramps or whatever. So it's kind of looking at what the drug is too.
One other thing I want to mention that we haven't talked about yet is that for those of you that have teens in your house, if they get if they're on a traffic stop and they get arrested with one hydrocodone pill, one Vicodin pill in their pocket, they can be charged with a felony drug crime with that. Okay, if they have one of these cartridges that has THC concentrate in it, that's a felony level drug crime. Okay, that makes it difficult to get into that college that you thought they were going to get into. That makes them difficult to have jobs later on. That makes them difficult to rent apartments in the city of Bloomington because of our crime-free multi-housing. There's all kinds of repercussions from what we think are relatively benign or innocuous decisions. Be careful with that stuff. It's not just a little pill that they're taking at a party on the weekend. These are fairly... Absolutely.
It's really difficult to tell when they're utilizing a vape or a Juul and then putting THC in it, because they do that on purpose because of the flavored oils and things like that they put in there, so it takes over. So you cannot even smell a lot of times the marijuana in there. So that's very difficult. Well,
Juuls, no. E-cigarettes, technically, yes, that's how they were marketed. Juul is a type of e-cigarette that, that's the thing that looks more like a flash drive. So that's a newer version.
But yes, they are marketing, a lot of these are marketing to get off cigarettes. But the thing is they have more nicotine, a lot of them, than a cigarette.
Yeah. So, so here's one thing that I'll say, and that was kind of part of my reason for sharing my personal story, is the easiest way to tell if somebody's using something is by noticing what's different, what's out of character.
Yeah.
So physically, when I saw her, I knew because I saw her eyes. Her eyes were very red and bloodshot and sort of glossy. Yes, if you're using THC, no matter how, if you're inhaling it in some way, shape, or form, that is a common side effect. Yeah, so one thing that I would encourage you to check out topsecretproject.org, because we have all of the sort of warning signs and symptoms by type of drug on there. It can be difficult to discern between a specific drug, one from another, without true testing, but there are some telltale signs. But for my daughter, she was acting very differently. And so that's how I knew something was going on. I know we're up.
My quick recommendation is, as you guys are walking out, take your phone out. We all got it in our pockets. Take a picture of that. Take a screenshot of that. My personal favorite website is drugabuse.gov. It has a very nice searchable kind of Google type search bar in there. Type in whatever you are looking for. Warning signs of adolescent drug use, common drug paraphernalia. I mean, all kinds of different stuff there. Type in what you're looking for and do a little bit of research. This should be the starting point for you guys that are really interested in it. Give you a little bit of quick, condensed information, but we're hoping that you guys will spend some extra time tonight or over the next couple days and kind of educate yourself, or continue to educate yourself.
There's also a ton of handouts out on the table out there. One of them is 8 warning signs that your child may be using, so feel free to take those on the way out too. I know we're up against time, so maybe for the couple questions we have left, we can hang around a little bit afterwards and answer those individually. For those of you that want to kind of double check the room again and see if anything different or stands out now that you've heard the presentation, feel free to do that as well. But thank you all so much for making the commitment to be here tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you to
And
our
thank you to the
panelists.
City of Bloomington for
Yes,
having
thank
us
you.
out here.